So welcome to our last session on the living memory of cities. This is a series we've organized in collaboration with London Met. This is an informal gathering, and our session is being recorded. It will only be broadcast later. So please, if you do not wish to be recorded, do switch off your camera and microphone. We've already started working on the next season of talks starting in the autumn. These should be in a new format, with some sessions recorded in our office in London at Eric Parry Architects. Today we have with us Professor Matthew Barac from London Met, who's also played a crucial part in organizing these sessions. Matthew will be talking to us about affirmative irony in city making, practicing the Afropolitan future. The proceedings will be very simple. Eric will be chairing the session. Matthew will be doing his keynote presentation, and this will then be followed by the usual period of 4 questions. Finally, a note to thank everyone at Eric Parry Architects and also at London Met. And I would now give the floor to you, Eric, for your welcome and introduction. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it really gives a huge amount of pleasure to introduce Matthew to this last of the series, because in a way, our thinking, and I say that as a collective, has been one that has grown together and passed in parallel and then crossings over a long period of time, and it's terrific now to be able to feast on Matthew's own perception of cities, and particularly his work in those in Africa. So looking forward to this enormously and with great pleasure. It's over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk today about some of the work that I'm currently working on, which is very linked to a very live debate that is has become increasingly topical with the approaching Venice Biennale this year, which is going to be a very different curatorial event. But it brings to fruition some of the ideas and some of the thinking I've been working on, partly on my own and partly with colleagues for some years. This is just the customary disclaimer. It's a work in progress. It may seem a little bit when I go through this like a kind of annotated reading list, but that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to assemble some ideas in order to make a paper out of it. So your contributions would be very welcome towards the end. The topic, if you like, is really about the city of the future, but not a city as we know it. It's a city thought about at global scale with an emphasis on the context of Africa. Those of you who are familiar with the Venice Biennale will know that this year's curatorial curator is Leslie Locko, and her curatorial agenda this year is the Laboratory of the Future, in which she wants to see the exhibition itself as an instigator and as something much more than a showcase. She is very much pushing at the boundaries of what the exhibition has been and should be. For example, Africa has often been seen as the poor cousin in this exhibition, but now it's center stage with more than Africa and the Black diaspora, more than half of the exhibitors being explicitly from Africa. She speaks very eloquently when she talks about it of Africa's function in the world right now with regard to ideas of innovation and change. And in a recent article with Rowan Moore in The Guardian, she put this idea forward very strongly. We all know that cities in the global north are shrinking. We're all getting older. We're living longer, of course, which is one of the reasons. And of course, the fact of the fall of the birth mortality has increased the African population dramatically. But the average age in Africa is around 30 years old, whereas in the UK, it's certainly much older than that. And this idea of the city yet to come, which is a phrase drawn from Abdul Malik Simone's wonderful book, For the City Yet to Come, is very eloquently developed by Achille Mbembe, who to me is one of the most important philosophers of the day. He speaks in Out of the Dark Night, his recent landmark book, which is in fact from an earlier stage, about this idea of the African world to come. And I'll just read this little passage. I don't have to have time to read out very much, but he talks about the relationship of this idea of the future, which will be driven by the youth and by perhaps conditions in which poverty will still prevail, but the conditions of innovation and the need to innovate and the context for experimentation is going to be very vibrant. And he says, a name has been found for this African world to come, whose complex and mobile fabric slips constantly out of one form and into another, and turns away all languages and sonorities because it is no longer attached to any language of pure sounds. This body in motion, never in its place, whose center moves everywhere, this body moving in the enormous machine of the world, and that name is Afropolitanism. So this idea of Afropolitanism that we see beautifully developed in Achille Mbembe, and also developed quite differently in other discourses as an emerging notion of worldliness that emerges out of Africa and is not, as it were, the poor cousin of the cosmopolitanism seen as European, is something that we can think of as a fascinating problematic for thinking through post-colonial Africa and what its future might be. Mbembe talks about the nested forms, signs, and languages that make up post-colonial Africa in a way that is not available to logic, so that we can analyze it in a straightforward manner. And for this reason, the role of artistic thinking and of the urban imaginary is very significant to the future of cities, which are likely to become, the mega cities of the future, with Lagos seen to be quite probably the largest city in the world in years to come. So he talks about the work of Afropolitanism as recomposing life in the context of paradoxes, complexity, and ambiguity. And this revival, if you like, of cosmopolitanism, which has had a bad rap in recent years and seen very much as a kind of Eurocentric concept, which cannot be thought of in worldly terms, is echoed by Kwame Anthony Appiah, another wonderful philosopher and literary critic, who talks in his book Cosmopolitanism he asks the question of how do we proceed, and he wants us to get back to cosmopolitanism in order to think about this idea of the citizen of the world being more inclusive and more meaningful in the epoch of reconfiguring and reckoning that we are living through at present. So mindful that I have limited time, I am going to race through my slides. I have cut them down quite dramatically because I want to keep to the 30 to 40 minutes. But I'm still going to talk through 7 sections, the first of which will take rather longer than the rest, to really establish what my topic is, and then give you a sense of what the shape is going to be of the argument that I'm looking to make, notwithstanding the fact that the argument might seem a little elusive at this time. It certainly responds to my sense and feeling of what this issue can be, how we can address it. And my key concern is this issue of an Afropolitan disposition with regard to architecture and design in relation to thinking about cities in their concrete reality, by which I mean the concreteness not only of the physical city, but also how we interpret it, envisage it, and are situated within it. So the city obviously is something that we take for granted. It connects and differentiates, but the city in its history has had a great deal of attention in recent years, and much of this attention is linked to the kind of impending tipping point of 2007, when half the world's population suddenly lived in cities. I think at that time the population was 7 billion. Now it's considerably more. And the question of continuity, that continuity and connection, is of course a perennial one in this seminar, which concerns memory continuity, and is indebted, of course, to the teachings and example of Dalibor Vesely, whose book with Moyes and Mustafavi, and with an important contribution by Peter Carl, we all know as Architecture and Continuity, the studio at the AA. And that question of continuity is something which doesn't necessarily happen between cities, although we know that they are connected. And Saskia Sassen's global city thesis was very interesting in that it brought attention to our notion of cities having a command and control function over one another and over the planet, in fact. So at that time, I became quite interested, and I remember asking a question at one of her talks about the impact that this debate was having on the idea of competitive advantage between cities. We are all familiar with the Mercer, or if not the Mercer, the Monocle rankings, city rankings, which come out each year, and every year, is it going to be Copenhagen, isn't going to be Melbourne, is it going to be Vancouver who are at the top? But nevertheless, the idea that the cities at the top garner huge investment and are very significant to the future of the planet is one that can cause us to overlook, was my question, those cities nearer the bottom. What about the cities that are apparently not so important in this global debate about the city? And just to broaden what this, how this debate mapped out, I mean, that was the time of the introduction of the LSE Cities program, and a number of people who are here at this event, I think, will have been involved in that, not least Eric Parry, who I think was part of the early team, with Ricky Burdett, and Karen Steele, of course, was involved. One of my colleagues from Cambridge, Savas Ved, is still teaching there. And it was a very significant impact on debate with regard especially to these top cities, but it was also sensitive to the role of architecture in relation to the city, which is one which is a discourse in which we are, of course, also indebted to the example of the Architectural Research Unit in the memory of Florian Bagel, and of course to Philip Christou, who has contributed to this series. So these contextual issues with regard to the city give us some baggage to think about where the city is today and how we tend to overlook some of those cities that may teach us something, typically from the global south, and also in some ways give us a better example to root us to the topography of our shared lived experience in the city. And this is a picture I took on a recent trip to New York from Central Park, which looks kind of peaceful, but it is really mind-boggling when you first see what's been happening to New York with these crazy pencil towers, which are clearly trying to escape gravity. And the idea that the priority in the city should be to get as far away from the street and to seem out of this world is in stark contrast to the idea of the nature or nature reformulated as it is in Central Park. I think, and this is a picture that I took. I managed to get to the top of the white collar factory with my friend James one day, and took this picture of our own city of London. And this is the city, of course, but this city, which again is creating a world in which the memory of what London is or should be is sometimes one feels a little like one is forgetting what that memory is, notwithstanding the fact that it has a wonderful kind of variety on its skyline, with perhaps one or two monstrous exceptions that we won't talk about right now. But this kind of city is really the opposite to cities that have become increasingly the norm in the global south, with the massive patterns of urbanization and, of course, the mobility arising from refugee movements or migration movements. I mean, those migration movements in this country, which is South Africa, have been part of its history for as long as I can remember, and I was born there 57 years ago. So, and I can't remember all of that time, but certainly internal migration has been a pattern that has been part of South Africa forever because of the apartheid laws, certainly until 1994. But still, these patterns of movement and economic migration, as well as other drivers, mean that there is sometimes not that much space between the infrastructure and the intimacy of everyday occupations. That tension is one that I remember Deborah Sant driving home in relation to some of her teaching with David Hills of Cambridge in a unit that they did there many years ago, and into which I contributed. But this tension between infrastructure and intimacy is really brought into stark relief in many of the cities of the global south, where infrastructure can have a profoundly abstract impact. This is a photo taken by a former PhD student of mine, and in fact of Peter Carl and Ines Weissman and Helen no, not Helen, but Ines Weissman, I believe, taught him at one point. But he wrote a history of a city that disappeared and was replaced by this kind of housing, seen to be the infrastructural vision of the future for parts of Luanda. The other kind of urbanity that is increasingly probable in parts of the global south is this kind of housing built in a way that is in stark contrast to our thinking about what materials we should be using in the era of climate emergency. But this is in Gay Estate. It's allied to, if you like, Kibera, which for a period was the largest so-called slum in the world, outside of Nairobi. And this is intensive urban housing in which the character of intensity is profound. I need to speed up. And then this was my own fieldwork study area site called Victoria Mclinge. This was taken in 2002 by my longtime colleague and friend David Southwood, who climbed up the scissor lift to take it, looking down onto the water point in the area, which then changed due to an urban development project which I followed. But this kind of view into a very kind of grounded and neighborhood which feels thick with intensity, and into which you can see into the spaces that people inhabit, and at the same time see the texture. In the distance behind the fog is Table Mountain. You can't really see it, but Table Mountain is the landmark mountain at the heart of South Africa, of Cape Town, known as the Mother City. Mother City, of course, is a translation of metropolis, and we will come back to that point. So I just want to come back now to, if you like, my theoretical starting point, which is to ask how we behave as architects, which I'm trying to justify my approach in this paper. This is a wonderful quote from David Leatherbarrow's Uncommon Ground, where he talks about the role of the architect. An architect stands before a city seeking to describe it. Lacking a plan, map, or survey, he intends to develop one. His purpose is neither design nor construction. Instead, understanding and measurement will be his method. So I'm very interested in this idea of measurement, and how, as architects, we need to be able to see the city in order to make it meaningfully, especially with regard to this concept of topography, which has become central to many of our discourses, and in which I was very much inducted by Peter Carl, my supervisor, and a big influence on my thinking. The issue of measurement in the work of Paulo Moreira, who I spoke about earlier, has recently been raised with regard to ideas of criticality. How do we practice in a way that is also learning from and listening to how in contested communities there might be an enormous range of issues which architects should take on board. And this is a book that focuses on the global south and the several case studies. In this understanding of the role of the architect to understand, I've always found the work of my colleague Maurice Mitchell, now emeritus professor at London Met, really instructive. Maurice came up with this wonderful concept of the architect as detective, which he worked through quite wonderfully in his book with Bo Tang and Shamoon Patwari, learning from Delhi. So some of those ideas of how to look at and then work with the city as it is are very interesting. But my idea about the tension between understanding the city as it is and then exerting some kind of control over it and appropriating it, is captured in this vignette. This is a picture of Vicky Ntozini. She was known as the landlady of the smallest hotel in the world. It was a B&B called Vicky's Place, which was in a shack in Khayelitsha, and this picture actually is taken from the Sunday Times magazine in 2003. She became a real media darling at the time. And quite successful. She said, so many white people were coming here to my shack that people thought I was in trouble with the authorities. And she had a kind of ironic set of jokes about the local sites. She would take people to a large sand dune locally, which you can climb to see the whole township spread beneath, she said. It's called the Khayelitsha Table Mountain. And she also, those of you who've been to Cape Town will know that the waterfront is a very upmarket and from its early years, certainly primarily wealthy white shopping area and gated community. She said, we also have our own waterfront here. It's a shebeen. The music is loud. You buy your drinks through iron bars. So that was Vicky's way of asserting her own character and her identity and starting her business in township tourism. But the other view that you can see on this screen is a view from Rhodes Memorial. Rhodes Memorial largely sort of desecrated now, if you like, but many of you will know about the Rhodes Must Fall, incredibly powerful protest movement which started at the University of Cape Town, which is just below this statue. The statue called, I can't remember what it's called, something like the rider. No, it's got a different anyway, something like that. But the equestrian statue overlooks the Cape Flats, which is all of the neighborhoods outside Cape Town, which were formerly, which are still black and mixed race neighborhoods, but they were formerly racially divided. So black and mixed race people were not actually allowed to live in the white city, which is where the money and the business was. So that sense of looking down on the township spread beneath is definitely a very ironic maneuver on the part of Vicky Ntozini. So she has her way of dealing with the baggage, if you like, of the city and its meaning in the context not only of South Africa, but of most African cities. An urban legacy in which many of the actual inhabitants of those cities felt that they were trying to live under the radar, trying to escape being found out by the authorities or having people interfere with their lives. And this transition over the long period of decolonization, which of course continues, is one that creates a great deal of ambivalence. And I use that phrase in relation to Homi Bhabha's conceptualization of ambivalence. Ambivalence with regard to individual points of view, that is to say, it has an impact on the subjectivity of citizens, how people get to feel about their own right to citizenship and their own commitment as a citizen, but also in culture and the arts. And I'm particularly interested in this dimension of culture. So William Kentridge is one significant artist. I unfortunately didn't get to put all the slides in of all of the artists. I wanted to talk also about Zanele Muholi, but I'll save that for another talk. William Kentridge has a long history of talking about and exhibiting work with regard to this ambivalence and the difficulties of really coming to a point of reconciliation with the past. So this issue of memory is fraught and problematic, and it draws upon in Kentridge's work, as well as the work of people like Zanele Muholi. It draws on the work of the absurdists, and Kentridge's play Ubu and the Truth Commission, which was scripted by Jane Taylor, is a very good example of that. Now, many of you may have seen William Kentridge's 2 exhibitions in recent years, and Zanele Muholi's at the Tate Modern, and so you'll understand something of this context. But these cities that are characterized by division and separation and difficulty and the typicality of the post-colonial and decolonization processes and their impacts on cities are also, Jenny Robinson reminds us, ordinary cities. And so it is relevant to make comparisons and to work in the field of ordinary life when we talk about cities. Jenny Robinson tells us that we need to be very careful not to relegate, if you like, huge parts of the world to this narrow margin between modernity and development. And so one of the things about the Venice Biennale's call to arms is that it's encouraging us to appreciate and enjoy the culture, a cross-cultural and Afropolitan, if you like, worldly culture of worlding cities across the planet in a way that allows people to have their own perspectives or to have regional perspectives which can shine light on our own understandings. And of course, the other powerful impacts on urban debate in recent years have come from the extraordinary patterns of mobility and migration. A key contribution from the point of view of Africa was an exhibition called African Mobilities, which was curated by the wonderful Mpho Matsipa. Mpho is a very talented architect and academic, and she curated this show, which was funded through the Goethe Institute and related organizations, but which then turned into a podcast and has spawned a great deal of satellite debate around. So I'm going on to the second section, and I'm going to now speed up a little bit. The second section is about the context of the street, having talked about the city and moving from, as Suzanne Hall's book title, top right-hand side, says city to street. We think of the street as the space of encounter, but key authors, and I include among those some of my friends, key authors have told us about the relationship between the street and other dimensions of the city in ways that are instructive. Firstly, I'm thinking of Suzanne Hall. Suzanne Hall, who in fact I once sat quite near in an office in Cape Town for a period of time in Woodstock. And Suzanne, in her work, she has talked about this scale relationship between street and world, calling upon Charles Wright Mills, in fact, Charles Wright Mills, a wonderful sociologist who wrote about the relationship between history and biography, as the history capturing the narrative of society, and biography in our individual narratives, biography also referring to the heroes who mediate between those two scales. And she used this in her book, City, Street and Citizen, I think probably drawing in the architectural review that I guest edited in 2007 about South Africa. I drew on the same, I raised the same trope in my introductory article, talking about how this relationship of times between history and biography is also a relationship between the temporality of the street and of the world in its cycles, and how we can articulate with those times and places. And she draws very well, she speaks very eloquently about that in her books, and draws about it beautifully, which I will show you some examples in a moment. Jane Klossick, in her work on urban depth, which from her PhD, which was supervised by Peter Carl, she has started to write now with Ben Coburn, who's a philosopher, about the relationship between urban depth and autonomy, and how the depth structure of blocks and streets creates an opportunity for individuals and groups to unfold their topographical structure of relationships to one another and to the city at large. Certainly I remember from my own days as a postgraduate student, Peter's work on urban depth, and particularly the metabolism, as he called it, of urban life thought of as a topography of institutions, but mapped out in concrete form in the city which divides and connects at the same time, which differentiates, I should say, and connects. And many of you will be familiar with some of his writings, including the ARQ article listed on the screen. And finally, in the list of 4 that I chose to mention, Fiona Scott's work, initially supported in her time as an Architects Journal scholar, looked at the street as a device in which the dialogue between the street elevations and the depth of the block would create this highly articulated zone and set of relationships which could be understood in spatial and design terms. And so here in Suzanne Hall's extremely evocative drawings, the one on the right is of the Walworth Road, where for her doctoral fieldwork she went up and down the Walworth Road with a clipboard talking to everybody and found where they had come from and discovered that actually in that single mile of shops and apartments and places of work, a whole world existed. So the kind of multiculture of South London creates a worldliness which may feel quite provincial at times when you're there, and yet it reminds us that in this economic and cultural hot melting pot, we have a very worldly and sophisticated cultural mix. And that is a technique that she has developed in other projects. And on the left, you can see a project which she developed with some of her research assistants and colleagues and students. And this method of getting to scratch beneath the surface to understand the not only the sometimes concealed economies, but also the concealed cosmopolitanism of places, particularly in the UK, is a very exciting dimension of her work. And unfortunately, the one on the left is a little pixelated, but these are some of the wonderful drawings of Fiona Scott that demonstrate through drawing a different kind of drawing, how the attention of the hand and pencil to the page can tell you a lot about the relationship between the front, the middle, the back. And I'm also reminded, I couldn't find them, but of those wonderful sections that Eric and his team developed on a survey project to India, which was published in the Architectural Review back in the 1980s. This idea of the street as a territory for discovery of the city on foot, in the manner of Michel de Certeau's inspiration through walking the city as a mode of knowing the city, is one that we often refer as architectural academics, and in this circle as well, to the figure of the flaneur, but that idea of the flaneur as a stylish individual who is both disaffected and at the same time highly urban in his, and it's normally his, disposition, is one that also has a history of popularity and appropriation in parts of Africa, the kind of the high life movement that we associate with Ghana and Nigeria. And this image is from South Africa. These the guys like this in the 60s and 70s, and it's a style, a township style that is still very prevalent today, wearing sharp hats and generating street style dispositions and attitudes, which are very much part of a sophisticated urbanity that is often not available certainly to mainstream discourse in our thinking about cities. Leslie Bank is a particularly good author on this. But these ideas about style and the enactment of urban life with regard to the territory of the street and navigating the street and navigating what it means to be cosmopolitan is certainly indebted historically to the figure of the dandy and the dandy's performance of worldliness as a personal style that is, if you like, to an extent emancipated from the limits of immediate conditions. The famous examples in history are Thomas Carlyle's, or rather literature, Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus of 1836, and Baudelaire's The Painter of Modern Life, Balzac as well. And the image at the bottom is an illustration from Sartor Resartus, where the dandy is reading Pelham, which is supposed to be a Bible for dandies. But less evident to perhaps to members of this audience is the sapper, although the sapper has become more mainstream in recent years, having appeared on pop videos by Beyonce's sister Solange, for example. The sappers from the Congo, from Brazzaville and Kinshasa in particular, came into being in the 1960s. And the Congolese sapper is very proud of dressing and behaving elegantly. Sapper, S-A-P-E, stands for Société des ambianceurs et des personnes élégantes in French, Society of Ambience Makers and Elegant People. And their mode of dressing, performing, behaving, and being men about town is tinged with satire in conditions, as you can see on the left, which are often anything but opulent and elegant. But they perform this wealth and are, if you like, the prefigure the influences of today's Instagram accounts. The relationship between the sapper and the dandy doesn't really have to be reinforced, it's clear. But in their love of fashion, sappers also see good manners as a way to demonstrate respect and their commitment to living a refined life. Courtesy and politeness are seen as very masculine in this argument for a way of being urban. So I am going to speed up now. The third category is the home, which is the space of self and object. And the book, top right-hand corner, is called Two Dogs and Freedom. It captured a whole lot of stories from children who wrote and drew their visions of post-apartheid South Africa and what it might be like. And one of the children said, "All I want is 2 dogs and freedom." I'll leave it at that. A range of other sources. I mean, the next in line is a chapter that I wrote about treating the home as a theatre of hopes and ideals, from a book called Reading the Architecture of Underprivileged Classes, edited by Namdi Ella, who is the head of Johannesburg School of Architecture, the University of Witwatersrand. And I'll show you an image or two from my fieldwork, which led to the chapter that I wrote there. But perhaps slightly left field reference here to that concept of home is that captured in the idea of a New York-based subculture originally, who were responsible for voguing, which is a dance style and lifestyle, who created a whole structure of families and houses, co-produced, if you like, surrogate families and houses where they felt that they had been rejected by the world around them, founded by their so-called legendary mothers. And this, still at the bottom, is from it's a film poster for Paris is Burning. That is a film that celebrated that life. And the idea of claiming and creating the home, from an ironic standpoint, is one that I will come back to. But these images, the image on the left is from there. You can see the 2 dogs, which in many shacks that you would go into in South Africa at that time, you would find these 2 dogs that would be standing like sentries on a display cabinet on a tabletop topography, which would demonstrate something of the aspirations and intentions of a world that could be controlled when people who live in these environments often couldn't control anything else about where they lived in their so-called arrival cities, as Khayelitsha is something of an arrival city for many. And the image on the right is a period photograph from Wendy Schwegman, showing the need for families often to be relocated at short notice. This family has packed everything up into a few boxes and is waiting to be moved due to the impact of the group areas act, which was a policy that picked families up who were told that they suddenly lived in a white neighborhood that they didn't live in before, and moved off somewhere else. So they did not have control over where they lived, and all they could control with their objects. So the relationship between those objects becomes increasingly important. Those tabletop topographies demonstrate something of a culture of display, but display is also something that we have talked about with regard to these practices of cosmopolitanism that we see in the dandy, the flaneur, and the sapeur in the Congo, and similar styling cultures elsewhere on the African continent. I have written about this in a chapter I did for that wonderful book that Max Sternberg and Henrietta Steiner put together called Phenomenologies of the City, in which I draw on Vicky Bell's idea of performativity and the arts of existence, where she talks about this idea of ways of performing in regard to Deleuze's dispositif, Deleuze's idea of the disposition that one has in order to construct and reciprocally develop one's subjectivity. I also wanted to mention, with regard to this idea of spectacle, a relationship to the previous slide where I talked about Paris is burning. The idea of voguing is also welding a countercultural reality and a claim to belonging. The poster on the right in the middle is from U Carmen y Khayelitsha, Carmen of Khayelitsha, which was a grandiose township opera that was produced, taking the opera and setting it in a shanty town, the shanty town where I did my field work, in fact. By putting Carmen in the shanty town, it produces a new kind of hybridity of not only the opera experience, but also the impacts of that setting on the drama. I wanted to mention that as another dimension of this ironic appropriation that produces new forms of culture. And finally, it's a very short walk from this these comments on spectacle to the example of Wakanda, which possibly ironically, but as you will find, those of you who go to Venice, this reappropriation of the African future as Afrofuturism, experienced not only through Wakanda, but many other examples, has become increasingly a hot topic. So with regard to that idea of voguing, as it becomes a two-way appropriation in which the voguers are not only playing with their identities or manipulating perhaps gender at times, but also who they are. There's an emphasis on posing, but in that posing and in that adopting of personas and being beautiful and fabulous, there is also a claim to realness, where their real wants and desires and personalities are not hidden, but are out in the open to be enjoyed and to create a spectacle. That appropriation of realness, of being an executive realness, or being a housewife, is also turned the other way through the reappropriation by money-making pop stars like Malcolm McLaren, who was very good at reappropriating the work of others, who brought out his own hit record several years before Madonna made an international sensation out of voguing and brought it to the mainstream in her hit record of 1995. Wakanda, on the other hand, is very much a reimagining of the Afrofuture, as it is referred to, which we see in the arts more generally. But this African future, seen as a different version of modernity that comes out of Africa, and is not an extractive form of understanding Africa's resources, but rather one in which Africa produces its own technologies and its own versions of a superhero environment, is one that has a very strong message for urbanity at large. And these examples of a kind of appropriation of the ironic disposition, which can produce a sense of reversal and appropriation, is again not new, and the references to whether it's Jean Genet or Frantz Fanon or the Surrealists, Antonin Artaud, and so forth, are very strong. My key reference here is Marcel Duchamp, which is where this phrase affirmative irony comes from in regard to his irony of affirmation, particularly in its reinterpretation by Richard Hamilton, who Duchamp referred to as the great decipherer. And the idea that in the ironic appropriation of oneself and representation of oneself through irony, and one thinks of Marcel Duchamp's presentation of himself as Rose c'est la vie, which I think is a reference that another speaker made in one of these seminars earlier, is instructive here. So this idea that one gets to a realness, which is a kind of a realness that is not real on the surface, is one that RuPaul, who is the important figure in the history of voguing and the history of that New York nightlife that I was talking about earlier, is a good example. But this idea of producing something that is more real in the way that we can understand its style is a lesson also that comes through Susan Sontag, especially her essay Notes on Camp. And my final reference here is from the ineffable Quentin Crisp in his book with Donald Carroll, where he talks about style and this idea of style in relation to realness as very much the opposite of fashion, and very much the opposite of posing for its own sake, but it's le style c'est l'homme même, it's the man himself, which is the real thing, the real person. And so towards the end, nearly there, I come back to a formulation that I worked on some years ago and developed in a paper that I wrote called Place Resists Grounding African Order in an Age of Global Change, to talk about slow topography. This idea of slow topography being a kind of a call to urbanists and architects to return to and emphasize the need for the concrete reality of the lived environment to exert a drag on the abstraction, and the tendency towards, what Simmel called the problem of calculation with regard to the metropolis over 100 years ago, but of course it's far more abstract and difficult now, so that we can maintain a groundedness to our claims to understanding the city as it is, and bring us back to the places that we inhabit. This idea of a grounded topography is not at all different from the need from a call for the need to imagine things differently. And the Afrofuturism movement, and certainly the Afropolitan discourse, is an excellent example of how this relationship between not forgetting who we are and that we are all people inside our skins, but at the same time that we can use our imaginations and not rest until we have done so, is very important. So I'm just going to show a wonderful image of Olalekan Geoffis's work. This sprang onto the scene as a critique, actually, of the Eco-Atlantic scheme in Lagos, and has done the rounds, and has now he has also done projects in Brooklyn and elsewhere. But at the time that he put images like this and related images into circulation, he did it rather surreptitiously, and in fact people thought that this was about to be built. It isn't about to be built, but it definitely demonstrates a different version of the African future to that put about by the urbanists and politicians who are so keen to think about places like Eco-Atlantic in Lagos as the next Singapore in Africa. And many of the urban plans in Africa are what Vanessa Watson has called African urban fantasies, which are very damaging to the capacity of that continent to move progressively to the future. So I think I've repeated this one. Yes, I have. Sorry about that. That went the wrong way. And so my final section is just to point to some of the architects and thinkers who are really taking us into a kind of thinking about hybridity at the scale of infrastructure. And I use hybrid here also in regard to the wonderful example of Homi Bhabha and his writings on hybridity as an acknowledgement of the essential complexity and difficulty of the kinds of subjectivity that emerge out of the post-colonial moment. Much of the architectural debate about the relationship between the global north and global south for a long period has been somewhat simplistic, but we're finding with some of the wonderful generation of thinkers and doers who, if you like, are not just African, but Black Atlantic, African diaspora, as it were. Not, perhaps it's wrong to say not just African, but that is just to say it's a very inclusive debate, as the Afropolitan discourse is. The first is Sumaya Valley, who we will all have heard of, and perhaps met at the Serpentine Pavilion when she launched her kind of neo-postmodern pavilion, which was which had and still has an extraordinary story about making connections between places and people, to the extent that it brought all a whole range of memories and belongings together in this building that added up to a lot more than the form of the building itself. And pieces of this building ended up in satellite locations and important Black history locations around the city, to say the Serpentine is not just about a bunch of invitees quaffing white wine. It is actually also about other urbanities in other parts of London which may not have that advantage. McKenna McKecker has for a good 25 years been designing quite futuristic and exciting projects, and working really as a emerging leader for architecture. He has been a recipient of the World Economic Forum Young Leaders Fellowship, among many other accolades, and is now very much coming of age in order to take these ideas about the Afropolitan future forward. He, in fact, is going to be he's working with me at the Venice Biennale to deliver a series of dialogues which will take place in the British Pavilion. And if you're interested in hearing more about them, let me know. Leslie Locker, nobody can have really not heard about Leslie Locker in recent times. She won the Annie Spink Award a couple of years ago. Then the other award, the other important award that I can't remember the name of, the Critics Award from the Architectural Review, and of course has started the African Futures Institute, which is an extremely important initiative. Perhaps since the initiation of the African Centre for Cities by Edgar Peterser, there has been no more significant development in African architectural thinking. And so we eagerly await what's going to happen at the Venice Biennale, but also Leslie is a contributor to debate and education, and also to wider architectural debate, especially around race equity and Blackness. And finally, Tao Dufour, who worked for Eric Parry Architects for a period, who in his work on urban environmentalities is thinking through, if you like, phenomenological hermeneutics in a way that emerges out of a range of different discourses, including his work on the Caribbean. And Tao's thinking, interdisciplinary thinking, and his use of film brings these ideas of poetic and performative and spatial histories and philosophies together quite beautifully. So that is what I have to say about, it is a bit impressionistic, but that's what I have to say about my ideas about the African future today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, for putting together such a complex and rich jigsaw of the circumstances and many people who have obviously contributed to the research kind of profile generally. I'm looking for questions. Christian, terrific. Good to see you. Here we go. You first.
Hi, Matthew. Good to hear some of your work, because we talk about other stuff, but not often our own work enough. I was reminded of the time I spent in Berlin in the early 90s, just after the wall came down, when you were talking about slow topography and change. And what was very interesting at that time was that all of the East Germans wanted to come and live in West Berlin because they wanted the infrastructure and the look of modernity that they felt they'd been deprived of after all those years under communist rule. And all of the West Berliners wanted to move into Prenzlauer Berg, where there was perhaps more of the slow topography that was going on. Many of the buildings from pre-war Berlin had survived intact during that period. And so I was sort of wondering whether one could say, or whether you could comment on, whether the people living in the townships want to sort of move into the glass towers of Durban or Cape Town in the same way that the East Germans wanted to move into the shiny white modernist world of West Berlin, and or whether there's a slight adaptation to the way we might understand this, because I think the danger might be if the West Berliners had told the East Berliners, we love your stuff and you should stay there as well, they might be thinking that they were being deprived of some form of newness, some form of modernity, which the rest of the world they had seen under their under communist regime as having speeding off in a different direction. So does that make sense as a question? It's really about how we look at it from the outside and how those people think about it themselves. Is there something you could perhaps draw on from that?
Yeah, no, I completely see what you're saying, and I agree. I mean, I think it's been particularly difficult with the proliferation of communications technologies, and everyone in every slum who I have ever met, whether it's in any country, has always got a mobile phone. They might need to charge it all the time, have SIM card input or whatever. But I think increasingly, I didn't put up as many images as I could have of the way some of those shacks are wallpapered with images of New York or Grace Jones or Will Smith, and these images of what is on the other side of the world absolutely preoccupy people. I think there's also so I think more in Africa more than anywhere else, and I think this is one of the things that some of the new research is trying to do, is to deal with. In Africa more than anywhere else, you find that many people who you meet are busy planning to be somewhere else. They're wanting to use the city as a stopping off point for somewhere else. And you find a lot of research encourages that or romanticizes it. And it's certainly an idea that has been romanticized in our culture for many years. The idea of cosmopolitanism has meant being able to jump on a plane and not really caring about where you live, because you're a cosmopolitan, you can live anywhere. And I think one of the issues to do with this kind of call for slow topography is also that I'm trying to get us to care more about places and to understand that drag that they exert on us, and that is a way to ensure that we can understand in our bones what belonging really means through practices of embodiment and habits and memories. So I think it's a two-way thing. People really do want to move. People do often want to be somewhere else. People like Philip de Burke have written about this with regard to Kinshasa, where he talks about the invisible city, cities which nobody really believes what's there and everybody wants to be somewhere else. There was a wonderful academic called Dominique Malaquais who used to write about the city of rumor before she died tragically young. But she was talking about how in parts of Douala or other parts of West Africa, there is so much belief in conspiracy and magic that people don't actually believe the city around them, and they always are worrying about what might happen to them. So I think that this idea of finding ways to allow places to exert a drag upon us, create that kind of resistance, is very important. This doesn't really come from me. It comes from, I got it from Robert McCarter, who wrote in a wonderful pamphlet, Architecture, many, many years ago, the one with the Neil Denari images in it about place as resistance, which always struck me as a very, very strong concept.
Thanks. I just wonder then whether the spending some time talking about the different ways one could use the word cosmopolis might be a really interesting way of describing it, because of course it's the polis of the cosmos, which has a different heart of it, a different understanding of nature, rather than necessarily the superficial terminology of multiculturalism, which it deals with, as you say, in a much simpler way. But anyway, yeah, really interesting. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Just on that point, I think one of the things that I'm hoping to do, I've been talking to some colleagues at London Met about this, Harriet McKay and Maverny Cunningham. We're talking about looking at this idea of worlding, and especially the controversy around worlding in the kind of tension between the kind of Heideggerian understanding of what worlding might mean versus Gayatri Spivak's critique of that idea, and trying to think about that conceptualization of worlding with regard to cosmopolitanism and the cosmopolis, the idea that being a world citizen and worlding the city is something that can have a kind of an ethical anchor to it that is not necessarily divisive.
It's all right.
I
think Harriet's got a hand up as I was going to say. I think Harriet's got a hand up as well.
Okay.
I do,
Okay,
Nick,
thank
but
you.
you were first.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to return to Christian's point. It's a kind of extension what he was observing at the end of the kind of line of question about the relation between cosmopolis and cosmopolitanism, because there's something interesting I think about this idea of what we think about grounded topography or slow topography, and irony. And it kind of makes me think, when I, reading a little bit about the background of irony, think about how it was conceived, or at least it's developed in the ancient Greek world, about the notion of the comic or the kind of outsider. And in the way in the modern world, how it's conceived very differently from people like Kierkegaard, who talks about this idea of irony as being very specific to the kind of emerging modern condition of kind of self-invention in a way. And you described, Matthew, about this idea of affirmative irony, the kind of defiant appropriation that it entails. And I just kind of wonder whether, whether in a sense, what we're describing here, and in reference to somebody else I read, which is very interesting, about that irony is the result of a sense of a loss of center or a loss of place, and therefore we have to reinvent ourselves, we have to concoct it, we have to construct it, and how it actually is very much part of a kind of condition of modernity. And whether in fact irony is not about grounded topography, but about the very opposite, but it's actually a kind of reaction to try and reconstitute a sense of kind of order out of a chaos, or at least an extreme form of instrumental views about the modern world. I'm just kind of wondering how you see this idea of irony being mapped out in terms of topography. And maybe there's something about this idea in very much in terms of place. And you referred to the kind of writings of cosmopolitanism, this notion of planetarity, this idea in the sense that place is no longer a kind of necessary condition of our relationship to the world, but we can construe it as having an indifference about where we are, which is essentially what cosmopolitanism means, that you can drift into a world not really having a home. So how does irony become a kind of necessary condition, if you like, of that perception of the world? And is that telling us something about what modernity really is?
Thank you, Nick. You've given me a lot to chew on there. I think one of the things that is interesting, I mean, when I wrote the abstract for this talk, I talked about something about the situation of many of the shantytown dwellers that I interviewed when I was doing some field work which was really for my PhD, but I then went back and did more field work for follow-up work. What I found was some of these individuals for whom Vicky Imtazini, the hotel owner, can be treated as a kind of a representative or a symbol. They would have elaborate and extravagant interiors, some of them made from, a poster stuck on the wall and so forth, but still living in a shack and still feeling like they had very little on, they had a lot of bad luck. There was nothing on their side. I mean, the stories that I heard were quite depressing at times. And so it was when life deals you so many blows that you've got no weapon left in your armory except to laugh in the face of adversity. Irony becomes a kind of a way to turn that into something positive. And I think it's easy, I guess, well, I don't think it's easy, but I want to treat that, I want to see that as a heroic gesture. And that is why I should have included some of the work of Zanili Moholy in this exhibition, because her extraordinary portraits, which were up at the Tate Modern, I think last year or maybe the year before, she would make these very beautiful fashion plates where she would have, for instance, a headdress made of steel wool pan scourers stuck on her head, like a kind of Princess Leia headdress, an Afrofuturistic headdress, and turning the kind of the condition of being a victim and being overlooked and having nothing into something which nevertheless is affirmative in its ironic appropriation of the things that were oppressing that person is exactly the message. So I think I'm very I'm tending to look on the bright side of what affirmative irony might mean, but I do take your points. So thank you for that.
Thanks. I think, Harriet, you were going to follow. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Matthew. This was storming. It occurs to me that there's a kind of doubling down in terms of irony when you start to think about certain product brands that are very urban specific. I don't know if you probably know the Love Josie brand, and I have a water bottle that has Marlboro cigarette type font on it, and it says Johannesburg tap water, and then there's a strapline which says the safest thing you can do in this city. So that I think there is a kind of tranche of product making that is taking everything that you're saying to heart and is increasingly interesting in terms of a kind of it's not tourist art, but it's but it is ironic making for people. It could be from that city or from outside, but it's a comment, really. It's something I've been noticing.
I mean, I think that this I keep mentioning exhibitions, and this is very conscious. I'm wanting to talk about architecture in the city in a way that doesn't just talk about the buildings, but about the cultural milieu. And two other exhibitions spring to mind. The one is the Fashioning Masculinities exhibition, recently at the Victorian at the V&A, which had this image on the cover. I don't know if you can see it, but a kind of a black dandy on the cover, and then the Africa Fashion magazine, fashion catalogue, which had a very similar image on the cover. And these two exhibitions talk about the ways in which this doubling down on irony also becomes something where the makers and shapers of this discourse are laughing also at themselves. Wesley Ling a couple of years ago did a wonderful event. I think you were part of it, about fashion curation at the intersection of and developing these institutions differently. And I was reminded of I can't remember if it's a fashion brand in South Africa called Ama Bourgeois. Ama is the prefix in Xhosa, meaning a group of people, like Ama Xhosa is the Xhosa people, and Ama Bourgeois is a Africanized version of the word bourgeois. So it's BUJWA with Ama in front of it, as if to say we are a tribe of people who are aping or enjoying our fashion statement by being bourgeois, and it's very similar to the New York to the American ghetto terminology of bougie. And so these maneuvers very much doubling down on the ironic in a way that creates new forms of cultural communication slang, and I think it's something to be enjoyed, to the extent also that it can become part of a subjectivity in which the urban milieu is part of it. You know, our cities are so far, city making is so far removed from any of these concerns as we find it in much of the mainstream now. And you know, we've talked about how city making inevitably leads to these cappuccino spaces that are very much removed from these street styles and cultures of the future. And so I think for architects, it's important to be able to acknowledge this kind of debate more significantly.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we're probably reluctantly at a close at about this point, but I just wanted to say, unless there's anyone else who's rearing to go, that you know, I would sort of just like to mention, kind of in praise of field work, you know, in the sense of what actually informal settlements, shanty towns can illuminate fantastically through very close reading of nuances. So, you know, if I think of your work, Suzanne Hall's work, Tao de Soul's work, and many others, of course, but that sort of sense of sensitizing a reading of space by close reading, by surveying, by understanding, by slowly understanding, is something that needs to be given great credit, and it's an amazing way of actually beginning to develop, I think, a sense of spatial reading that's very important, particularly for architects. So, Matthew, thank you hugely for that, and we look forward to debating what comes next with our dear friends down the road. So, yeah, for now, anyway, a small pause and a break, but thanks for bringing up the rear and doing it so stormingly, as I think Harriet put it. Thanks so much.